February 24th, 2022, the start of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, a conflict that's reshaped Europe's security landscape and tested Moscow's resilience under sweeping Western sanctions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Washington is eyeing June as a possible ceasefire deadline as voices on both sides weigh the costs of continued fighting. Could this be the moment diplomacy finally prevails? Later, we'll go to Kyiv for a conversation with Peter Zalmayev. He heads the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, and to Moscow to talk with Voice of Russia political analyst Dmitry Babich. But we begin right here in the studio with Anton Fedyashin. He is history professor at American University and a Russian European affairs analyst. Anton, great to have you with us. Well, let's look at that question. Could diplomacy finally prevail? There's been another round of peace talks, and this is Ukrainian President Zelensky's assessment. Let's listen to him.
You can't say that we're losing the war. Honestly, we're definitely not losing it. Definitely. The question is whether we will win. Yes, that is the question, but it's a very costly question. That's why our proposal is, look, let's stand where we are standing now. A ceasefire there, then we move to dialogue. And from there, we'll see how it goes.
So, looking at Zelensky's broad plan there, Anton, a freeze at the current lines, a ceasefire, and then dialogue. And he did say that Ukraine is not losing. What is your view?
Well, unfortunately for Ukraine, it is losing. The Russians have already said very clearly that there will be no freezing of the conflict because they are concerned that a repetition of what happened with the Minsk II agreement in 2015 will take place, which is that hostilities are frozen and the Europeans, NATO, basically take that time to rearm Ukraine with the potential of this breaking out again several months or years later. It took 7 years from Minsk II to the conflict to re-erupt in 2022. And so this is off the table. Vladimir Zelensky is repeating his position, which is perfectly fine. He has the right to do so, but it's just not going to come to fruition. So there should be alternatives, and it doesn't sound to me like either side is willing to make the compromises that the other side expects from it.
So what then would Russia want to take that risk off the table, the risk of a resurgence of fighting at some point?
It will want an agreement, diplomatic agreement, that there will be no NATO in Ukraine. It will have to be involved in the determination of how big the Ukrainian army will be, and most importantly, and this is the part where the Russians are not yet willing to really compromise, and I doubt that they will in the foreseeable future, they want a territorial settlement. And they've even requested that this be internationally recognized, which I think is going to be a non-starter for most of the world, but at least it has to be recognized by the Ukrainians, and that's the 4 regions that they have annexed since the fall of 2022.
Right. Now, those 4 regions that they've annexed, Russia wants that to become part of Russia. There is a small portion in those in that region which is not yet under the control of Russia, but Russia is insistent that it wants all of it. How does that make Russia safer?
They are creating a buffer zone. They're doing what the Russians have done for centuries when they have felt threatened from the West. And from the Russian perspective, this war started because of NATO expansion and encroachment onto the territory of Ukraine without actually making Ukraine a part of NATO and giving it the benefit of the security of the organization, but instead leaving it with all of the risks of NATO actually slowly expanding its sphere of influence. And until that is taken off the table, I'm afraid that the Russians are not going to settle for anything short, which the grim realist in me sees as the guarantee of the continuation of this war into 2026 for the foreseeable future and potentially even beyond then.
How important is it that there seems to be more support from the United States side right now under President Trump for a settlement, broadly on the terms of what Russia wants?
Broadly, that seems to be where the Trump administration stands. The question is, will it be able to force the Ukrainians into ceding the territories that the Russians don't actually control, and that it will take them weeks, months, and maybe even years to actually conquer? And so far, all the indications are that the Trump administration does not have the wherewithal to actually force Ukraine into this decision without pulling all military support for the Ukrainian war effort, but that would be too radical a move for the Trump administration to make, because the political capital it would have to expand to justify it both to its allies abroad, but also here at home, is too great for Donald Trump to take.
There appears to be so many questions about how any kind of agreement will be enforced. How do both sides respect this agreement? As you point out, there is a concern that if there is no legal agreement, then Ukraine could go back to rearming, to re-importing weapons from the West, etc. So how do they overcome that?
Well, either everyone sits down and hammers out an agreement that includes the very painful territorial issue, or this conflict is settled on the battlefield. Those are the only two alternatives here. And one of the tragic ironies of this situation is that back right after the invasion, exactly 4 years ago, the Russians and the Ukrainians sat down in Istanbul, and they actually agreed generally on a bunch of principles, one of which was that the Russians agreed for the members of the Security Council of the UN to guarantee the security and safety of Ukraine. And back then, by the way, the 4 regions that the Russians have now claimed, they've de jure annexed, weren't even a part of the agreement. They didn't want those territories. They were ready to have all of that be part of Ukraine. But back then, the decision in the West and in Ukraine was to try and fight this out. And now, 4 years later, Ukraine has ceded more territory, is expected to cede even more territory, and there's no mechanism for enforcement yet.
You know, we started out by talking about the negotiations that are taking place right now to achieve some kind of settlement. There have been so many rounds of talks which have yielded nothing, really. But do you get the sense now that there is more urgency in reaching some kind of an agreement, especially when we look at rising casualty rates on both sides?
Yes, absolutely. And that's true about both sides, especially the Ukrainian side, because it has fewer resources, both in terms of manpower, but also in terms of economics and material. Ukraine is entirely dependent on outside sponsors, and they are increasingly unwilling to keep bankrolling this war. So yes, the Ukrainians are coming under enormous pressure, much more so than the Russians are. So time is also not on Ukraine's side. So sooner or later, one side or the other is going to have to start doing more compromising than the other side. And unfortunately for Ukraine, it looks to me like that's where the compromises will be coming from.
This is also taking place at a time when there are huge changes taking place in the globe right now, insofar as the balance of power is concerned. Russia has been able to withstand Western sanctions. It's even been able to grow since those sanctions were first imposed in March of 2014. What does this conflict tell you about the limits of Western deterrence?
Well, it tells us just how limited that deterrence is, especially when an administration in Washington, D.C. Prioritizes regions other than Eastern Europe in terms of its overall strategic view of the greatest threats and challenges to American security. And according to the Trump administration security strategy, the biggest issues are really coming out of Asia, not out of Ukraine or the cause of NATO expansion. That's number one. Number two, this is really a very important reminder about the nature of globalization and to what degree the military-industrial complexes of the West, especially in Europe, by the way, especially among America's NATO partners, have really atrophied over the past 30 years, and how dependent the Europeans had become on the United States for their security, to the point where they ended up buying all of their, well, not all, most of their weapons from the United States. They simply don't have enough to give to Ukraine on their own. And number three, of course, unlike the wars that the United States had been in over the past 20 years, which have not been against peer competitors, what this war has uncovered is a new phase in human warfare, which is much less reliant on heavy-duty machinery, tanks and armored personnel carriers, but much more reliant on high technology, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and the crucial importance of drones. So as we think about the future of warfare, not only is NATO really putting a lot of its eggs into the old baskets producing tanks and missiles, it's not putting its eggs into the basket that really matters, and that's the artificial intelligence linked specifically to unmanned aerial vehicles. So this war is really a revolution in warfare.
Anton, great to have you with us. Thanks. Over the weekend, more missile and drone strikes hit the Ukrainian capital as Russia intensifies its winter assaults on energy and military infrastructure. Joining us now from that very city, Kyiv, is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, Peter Zalmayev. Peter, great to have you with us.
Greetings.
There are more talks taking place right now to try and bring this conflict to an end. President Zelensky has been talking to major Western media outlets. He's been talking to the Financial Times. He's been talking to the United States network CNN, making Ukraine's case for peace. Where do things stand right now?
I think that the things stand right now where they have stood over the last consecutive rounds of these negotiations, with Vladimir Putin continuously just dragging out the time, trying to stop just short of Donald Trump losing his cool completely and introducing some really painful sanctions, which he has been doing here and there, but so far he has held off on the pressure that he feels from his own administration, his own party, including in Congress, to actually bring about much more substantial sanctions. So I think we're seeing a bit of a window dressing exercise on the part of the Russians and maybe even the Ukrainians, who are also, I'm not sure, are ready for those, not just territorial concessions that are being demanded of them, but we're talking about the general absence of ironclad security guarantees, which so far Ukraine hasn't seen.
Now, one of the other major changes that we have seen in the past few months, Peter, is the significant loss of United States support for Ukraine, diplomatic support, military support, political support as well. In fact, it seems now that Europe has become Ukraine's main benefactor. How big has that change been for Ukraine?
It's a substantial change, but before I proceed, let me just say that the bedrock support by the United States still holds. Donald Trump hasn't pulled all support from Ukraine yet. There's still sharing of military intelligence, and there is a supply of weaponry, albeit with European money, such as Patriot missiles, which is, of course, a commodity very hard to get, and it's only the Americans who produce that. So it's not so black and white. And at the same time, yes, Donald Trump seems to be willing to disengage in favor of some kind of a sweet deal with the Russians, potential commercial relations, etc. Europeans are now having to bear the brunt of this, the burden of support of Ukraine, and that is also showing signs of precarity, considering that Hungary has been successfully lately blocking the 90 billion package that Europe has approved for Ukraine.
And looking at some of the major obstacles on the way to peace, it looks like one of the major obstacles is the issue of territory. What is Ukraine's position on the Russian demand that Ukraine cede the eastern portion of Ukraine to Russia, including that fifth of the Donetsk region that it doesn't already have?
I think it's a poison pill for Zelensky. Putin knows that even talking about these territorial concessions without really, like I said, knowing what the security guarantees will be that Ukraine will get for those painful concessions is kind of a non-starter for Zelensky. He has ruled out time and again giving up on that land that is still under Ukraine's control, that still has thousands, if not tens of thousands of people living in there, and of course would give Russia a huge advantage were it to, consider attacking Ukraine again or continuing its aggression. We're talking about those fortress towns such as Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which would allow Russia to occupy commanding heights and improve significantly its military positions. So Vladimir Putin knows that this is a very, very tricky balancing act where Zelensky cannot simply rule it out, and at the same time, even bringing this question to a referendum, which it would necessitate, creates a plethora of problems, constitutional problems. Holding a referendum or presidential elections during time of war is anti-constitutional. And once again, if it were to be held, it could create chaos on the streets of Ukrainian towns and cities.
And what are the kinds of security guarantees that Ukraine is looking for? I mean, there is also the risk that there may be some kind of a settlement in the next few weeks, perhaps in the next few months, but there is also that risk, as I say, of violence or hostilities resurging at some point in the future.
Indeed, and we've seen it. It's not speculative to say that. Ukraine has said that Putin will not only not stop after a ceasefire is reached, he will not stop even if there's a, if he gobbles up Ukraine, he'll continue his aggression. That's simply the logic of his regime right now. He cannot stop, he cannot unwind, he has to keep going. And I think that, to the point of whether we can expect this flare-up hostilities once again, let's not go too far in the past. 2014, right? Crimea, that has led to the Donbass, and that finally led to 4 years ago a full-scale invasion. Once again, the logic dictates that Vladimir Putin is now boxed in with his rhetoric about bringing down Ukraine to its knees and full control over its foreign policy and political decisions modeled on Belarus and Georgia.
So what are the political constraints that President Zelensky is facing right now? I mean, you mentioned them a moment ago. He has also suggested elections accompanied by a referendum to test whether Ukrainians will accept this peace plan. But what does that mean for him politically?
It means for him politically that this is quite untenable once again, to negotiate based on some, nebulous promises of security guarantee by America, which would mean just a gentlemanly kind of word from the American president. We've been down that road before. We had that Budapest memorandum. If you remember, Ukraine got a piece of paper signed by the European powers and America in return for its nuclear weapons, and look what it's gotten us, really quite nothing. That's why what you hear in Ukraine lately is that unless it is backed up by Congress, a congressional resolution guaranteeing Ukraine's security modeled on the mutual security pact between the US and South Korea that was negotiated back in the 70s, unless we have that, it's very thin ice to tread upon.
Peter, one final point. As I mentioned in the introduction, you are in Kyiv, which has been the target of Russian missile strikes, especially on its energy infrastructure. This is midwinter in Kyiv right now. What can you tell us about conditions in the city?
Conditions are pretty, dire. We have a kind of a lopsided situation where, as in the past, people in Kyiv and other major towns could afford to go about their daily lives and not feel the brunt of the war, pretend like they're living in peace, with the exception of certain, times of day a week during, air raids, sirens and missile attacks, etc. You could have a normalcy of life while things at the front were quite precarious and quite threatening. Right now, it seems the front has kind of frozen. There's the momentum by the Russians has slowed down. The asymmetrical warfare with the use of the drones allows Ukraine to sort of stay in the game, and yet it is precisely behind the front lines, the civilians who are now suffering more than ever. We've come very close to a point where we may not be able to sustain peaceful life in Kyiv without massive evacuation.
Peter Zalmayev, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
In a recent interview, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of already starting World War III by invading Ukraine 4 years ago, saying he must be stopped to avoid global instability. Last year, President Putin voiced his concerns about the threat of World War III. Dmitry Babich is a journalist and Russian political analyst. He joins us now from Moscow. Dmitry, great to see you. Let me start by asking you about this claim by Zelensky that we are already in World War III and that President Putin is responsible for starting World War III.
Well, I think it's an exaggeration, and as usual, it's a dangerous exaggeration when it comes from Zelensky. It's a huge question if World War II, was the last one, the last major war in humanity's history. We know that it was not. But the problem was that the Cold War was not ended in an accurate way, in a right way. Mr. Gorbachev just got Russia out of the fighting, and there was no peace agreement signed after the Cold War ended. So, the United States and the European allies of Americans, they view themselves as victors in the Cold War, even though there was no peace treaty that would proclaim them the victors. So there was this discrepancy. The Westerners saw themselves as victors in the Cold War, and the Russians and Chinese saw themselves primarily as victors in the World War II. Hence, this huge contradiction, NATO expansion, which ultimately led to this terrible war in Ukraine. I don't want to say that Russia is angelic in this war, but certainly Russia was badly provoked by Ukraine and by the West, and by Mr. Zelensky in person, unfortunately.
Right, well, let's look at the situation right now. The Associated Press news agency, which is here in the United States, reports Ukrainian claims that its forces struck an industrial site deep inside Russia on Saturday. Ukraine claims that the site, which is situated in Udmurt Republic, was a, quote, key state-owned missile factory. There was a little bit of a confirmation from the Russian side on the strike. The local health ministry said that several people were injured and had to be taken to hospital. What do we know about this? What do you know about it? And what does it tell you about Russian air defenses?
Well, primarily, this situation shows us that Ukraine is getting huge technical assistance from the West. Because without the aid of Western companies, Western technologies, and probably without American or European pilots operating the drones, Ukrainians would have no way to strike so deep inside Russian territory. You know that until recently, we had the same equipment, the same military equipment with Ukrainians. 90% of it was Soviet-made. There was no such equipment that would enable Ukraine or Russia to strike so deep inside an enemy's territory with drones. So obviously, there is a lot of direct military support that Ukraine gets from the UK, from the European Union, and very likely from the United States, even though Mr. Trump promised that he would stop American aid, that this aid would be paid for by the European Union.
Right.
So, first of all, we know that the West helped make these strikes.
Yeah.
As for the air defenses, Russia is trying to defend its civilian population. Russia is trying to defend huge cities, but many objects, including oil refineries, and sometimes just peaceful people, get killed by Ukrainian drones. This is not reported in the Western press. It mostly concentrates on the casualties from Russian strikes. But I think the West should see both sides of the coin. People should see both sides of the coin. Ukraine is also committing terrorist acts, and making very cruel strikes against Russian territory.
Let's get to the peace process, the efforts underway right now to bring this conflict to an end. You have said that only a negotiated settlement can bring the conflict to an end. One of the major issues appears to be the issue of territory. What are the specific territorial concessions from Ukraine that would be acceptable to Russia?
I think the main thing, the main demand from Russia is that the territories that we would get as a result of the peace settlement, these territories should be proclaimed by Ukraine as legally belonging to Russia. No one knows the size of these territories. These could be divided by the front lines right now. These could be all of Donbass, as the Russian side has been claiming. But whatever the size of these territories, they should be acknowledged to be Russian by Ukraine. Because otherwise, here is what President Putin has said. If it is not acknowledged by Ukraine as Russian, this territory, then next year, or maybe in 2 years, after getting the weapons from Europe, Ukraine would restart the war, saying that we are fighting for our territory, we are fighting for our territorial integrity. And legally, they would have the right to do it. So the main Russian demands, they're not about territory, they're about security.
Okay, Dmitry, how motivated is Russia to come to a peace agreement very quickly? Because President Zelensky also told the Financial Times in an interview that Russia is mobilizing 40,000 troops per month and is losing 35,000 of those 40,000 troops each month.
The casualties is the big unknown in this war. Both sides are hiding their casualties because casualties is the most depressing thing. Russian society, just like Ukrainian society, we are European nations. We are very vulnerable to human deaths. Human life is appreciated in both Russia and Ukraine. So both sides decided to keep their losses secret. So I would not believe the figures that Mr. Zelensky gives, but believe me, Russia is very willing to end this conflict. Several Russian cities have been left without electricity in the middle of a very severe winter. Mm-hmm. It's not only Ukraine that suffers from cold. A lot of Russian cities are suffering from cold because of this war. And certainly this war is a huge risk, primarily for Ukraine, but also for Russia and for Europe and for the whole world. So if anyone is willing to end this war, this is Russia. And if you look at the statements and not at newspaper articles from European newspapers, you will see that Russia never refused to hold negotiations. It was Ukraine that ended negotiations in 2022 in spring in Istanbul, when we were very close to peace. And then the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson urged Ukraine to fight on. Okay. It was Ukraine that didn't agree to start peace negotiations until recently, until President Trump, in fact, forced them to have this negotiation.
Dmitry, thanks so much for joining us. We have to leave it there. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.